Welcome. I'm Brendan Riley. Like Andrew said, I'm faculty in the English department. I'm an associate professor. I've been here, this is my 9th year. I've taught zombies in popular media 5 years now, starting in 2007. This will be the 6th or 7th year coming up. So I've been doing it a while. I've got a number of ideas sort of settled into the curriculum that we talk about, and I thought today we would explore one of what I find the more interesting ideas, or particularly ideas you would be less likely to encounter in a conversation about zombie movies with your friends. So now you can bring it up and have a good time. So a little about me. This is at the Chicago Zombie Walk 2009. I am an English professor. I teach writing and new media courses. I also teach literature. Right now I'm teaching detective fiction. I also teach classes outside of the department sometimes, first year seminar or game culture, and then I'm most well known for zombies in popular media. This course is a January session course. It runs for 5 to 6 hours a day. It's 2.5 hours in the morning plus a screening of 1 to 2 movies every afternoon. There's homework every night, and by the end of your 3-week period, you've got 3 credits. It's a full semester's work in 3 weeks. I call it the crucible effect. If you know, a crucible, right, is a pottery making tool that provides intense heat to solidify the piece of clay that you're working on. And that's what this class does. By exposing you to zombies nonstop for 21 days or so, what happens is that you see overlaps between the text you would never see over the course of a semester when you're doing all sorts of other things as well. It also gives you an opportunity to carry these ideas forward into your classes as the creative project extends into the semester, and students often then combine it with work they're doing in other places. So I thought tonight we would talk about the 3 prongs of the course. I'll give you a quick introduction to what we do in the course, and then we'll focus on the 3rd. So the course explores the zombie, the figure of the zombie in popular culture, through 3 methods. The first is the Voodoo Zombie, which is the place that it enters popular consciousness. In the 1920s, after a writer named William Seabrook particularly goes to Haiti and writes about zombies, then people start to be aware of them. They start showing up in movies. This is the Voodoo Zombie. This is someone who has been enchanted with magic. They are being controlled by a zombie master, and they're made to do things. They're supposedly undead. If you look at more recent writing about what the voodoo zombie might be, perhaps they're brainwashed or brain damaged. There's all sorts of speculation. So we use this to talk about the history of the figure, to talk about some of the cultural studies elements that come into the class, to talk about the relationship of race to the idea of the zombie, and to think about how the zombie worked its way into our popular consciousness. The second thread of the course is the Hollywood zombie, or what some people might call the Romero zombie. Now, it's called the Romero zombie because it really didn't exist before 1968. 1968, George Romero takes the idea of the zombie, the voodoo zombie, this shambling, dead figure that's sort of not in control of itself and is really creepy, but always lives in the Caribbean. And he puts it in middle America, in rural Pennsylvania. He takes away the zombie master, and he makes it a cannibal. Now, those 3 things combined together make it an entirely different beast. And he actually calls them ghouls. He doesn't call them zombies early on. In fact, I don't know if he ever calls them zombies in his films. But that label was applied very quickly because they're so familiar. If you'd seen any of the movies that have zombies in the 1960s, I recommend I Eat Your Skin, by the way, which does not have any skin eating, but is really funny. That movie has zombies that are very close to what Romero is doing. But Romero has them in America. They're everybody, not just the victims of the voodoo masters. And so they become this different thing, and they take off into the form that we know now. When you hear someone talk about zombies, they're probably talking about Hollywood zombies. We've also seen a lot of overlap between those. There are a lot of Hollywood zombie movies that use voodoo as the mechanism by which zombies start. But the big difference is in a voodoo zombie movie, the virus doesn't spread. And in fact, usually the zombies aren't going to hurt anyone at all unless they're being told to kill. And then it's not with the biting and eating and all of that. By the way, the Hollywood zombie thing, it's very closely associated with the idea of brains, wanting brains. That's from one movie, or one series of movies called Return of the Living Dead. 1985. Before 85, you wouldn't have heard anyone talking about brains. In that movie, the zombies can talk. They can call on CBs to get more victims, and they use the word, they ask for brains, or they talk about brains. That's where that comes from. The 3rd thread that we talk about in the class, and we talk about all 3 concurrently, is the philosophical zombie. Now, this idea doesn't really appear in fiction very much. what we see is that the philosophical zombie is an idea that philosophers use to think about death and life and personhood and being and all sorts of things that we'll talk about today. But there are a bunch of films that overlap the idea. So that's how I get into the philosophical zombie in class. We read philosophy writing about it, but we watch films that are related. Like this one, does anybody know what this is from? Nobody? Donald Sutherland, 1979. It's Invasion of the Body Snatchers. It's the remake. This is the face that zombies make when they spot someone who's not a zombie. They make that face and scream. It's great. Okay, so we'll be talking about the philosophical zombie. Here he comes to get you. So what is a philosophical zombie? I'm going to break all of the rules about how one presents and read a quote to you because it's important. Philosophical zombies were dreamed up by philosophers as a thought experiment to test concepts and illustrate a variety of theoretical problems about the nature of consciousness and the mind's relation to the body, right? So it's to test problems related to consciousness. Keep that in mind. So how do we see this in film or fiction? The best example, the most clear one when I'm going to say, here's what a philosophical zombie is the Invasion of the Body Snatchers. This is the original one, 1956. Kevin McCarthy, you have to see this if you haven't. It's great. Even people who are really restrictive about what they'll call a zombie movie, they're willing to give us this one because it's so great. Anyway, so Invasion of the Body Snatchers, these aliens show up, only they don't show up as aliens, they show up as seed pods. And they grow into person-sized aliens, but they look just like people, and they take away all of the memories and personality of that person and then murder them. And then they present in their place as this person. They pretend to be them, and then they go around planting seed pods and killing other people and letting them be the new aliens. The difference, right, because there is a difference, is that the aliens have no emotion. So this idea in the film is that these are people just like us, but they do not have the emotion at the core that makes us what we are. And so the film is very much about the struggle by the characters to figure out what's going on against becoming part of this group. Now it's a pretty clear sort of anti-communist paranoia film when you see it. I mean, it's made in the 1950s. There's a great sequence at the end where he's screaming into the camera, they're coming to get you, they're already here. It's awesome. You definitely watch it. But what's going on in the film, right, it's a worry about the communist infiltration, this idea that communists who have given up their personal idea of freedom for this Mother Russia, for not having their own initiative, their own ideas, they're doing everything for the state, that's very clearly what's going on in the Invasion of the Body Snatchers narrative. Now, I'm honestly not as interested in the communist stuff. I mean, we talk about it, it's a good moment. But I think what I find really interesting about it is it gives us a way to think about how do we understand what it means to be a person. Because very clearly in the film, they're drawing the line that this other person who has all of the memories and all the personality and even can reason and talk like the person they were is not them. And there's a sort of cheap escape in this movie because they are literally not them. They are this plant-based being that has stolen their memories. It's very clear. But a lot of other zombie movies don't have that clear line. So as we explore this a little bit more, we'll think about that. But I want to highlight the second half of that definition I was getting to earlier. The only difference between a philosophical zombie and non-zombies, right? I'm not the difference between philosophical and Hollywood, but philosophical zombies and people, is the stipulated fact that the former philosophical zombies have no conscious state of mind, such as feelings of joy, pain, belief states, etc. So when philosophers use this idea, they are imagining a being that appears to every way of telling that it is us. It is a person. It feels pain, or it expresses pain if you stab it, right? It pretends to have emotion, it talks to you. But we know inside it has no mental state at all, right? And so the philosopher asks, what do we do with this being? How do we understand what it could be? And what does it tell us about more mundane things that we actually encounter? Places where what we consider to be a person, what we consider to be human, becomes blurry and fuzzy. So it's those big ideas that I want to talk about today. Because at the heart of this, the question being asked is, what does it mean to be a person? Okay, so there are three ideas I want to explore or sort of three key questions that we'll get into today. And I don't have solid answers. That's why these are big ideas, as Andrew said. If I had solid answers, it would be a shorter lecture and not as interesting. So the first question, what happens when someone we love becomes someone else? This is, of course, at the heart of many zombie movies, right? The person is bitten, they turn into someone else, right? But I think that there are analogs to real life that are much more interesting as far as understanding philosophy. How do we tell who or what is or isn't a person, right? Where do we draw that line for personhood? Now this one, in terms of real world right now at this moment, maybe doesn't seem like as big an issue, but I would argue it is a pressing issue, and if you're at all futuristic minded, or if you're a futurist or a post-humanist, as some people claim to be, it really is a pressing issue. So we'll get to that. We're going to get in the nerdy side of Brendan, if we're not already there. So finally, I'm really interested too in the way that zombie films explore the question of what happens to our humanity when we do inhumane things, right? Because zombie films often use the zombie as a way to get us into difficult situations. So let's dive right in. What happens when someone we love becomes someone else? The classic zombie film situation.
It's crackling a little bit.
Oh, okay. Thanks. The classic zombie film situation is someone we love, say our mother, is bitten, slowly becomes ill, dies, and is suddenly a zombie. When we're faced with that person, we have to decide, do we kill that zombie that's trying to kill me? We think we should. The rational argument is yes, you do. And the argument that the characters within the film give is that is not your mother anymore, right? That's the argument that's made. And most zombie films are happy to put us in that state. They'll show the emotional anguish of the person as they shoot their former loved one. But generally, the films do not undermine this idea that the person, the zombie, is still the person they were. However, I think it's safe to argue that it's not that easy to draw this line. And I'll explain why I think that's not so easy. But films are also starting to explore that question. So I'd like to pause for me talking for a moment and watch a clip. Oh, this is from Brain Dead or Dead Alive, right? The girl says, your mother ate my dog, and he says, not all of it. And he holds up a string of gristle. If you haven't seen Dead Alive, great movie. The goriest horror film probably ever. Peter Jackson, the guy who did Lord of the Rings, back before he was making serious movies, was making gory horror films. Okay, so we're going to watch a clip from Zombie Honeymoon. Let me set this up a little bit. Zombie Honeymoon is a Showtime film, fairly low production values, but really provocative script. The premise is this young couple goes on their honeymoon. The husband is menaced by a zombie, dies, and returns, but he does not return in the shambling, mindless, undead state. He returns, he appears to be normal, right? But he is definitely not. He's acting weird, he's angry, he doesn't really know what's going on. His wife goes out to get groceries, and then she returns home, and the scene we're going to watch is when she returns home. This scene is the grossest thing I'm going to show today, so if you are squeamish, you may not want to watch. Did someone say awesome?
Of course.
Very good. Excellent. It's their honeymoon. Come on.
need you. No.
Don't fucking touch me, alright? I said don't touch me! That's ridiculous.
All right, so a lot of really interesting stuff going on in that sequence, aside from the ludicrous with the hairdryer, right? And the idea that she would stop running. I mean, on its face, is very difficult to get to. What you missed, of course, is the build-up where they show them to be intensely in love. They're vegans, which is really, he can't take the meat. That's one of the subtexts is he can't take the meat, so he keeps barfing it up, which is extra fun. But I think there's a lot of really deep ideas going on in this film. Right? Because what Denise, that's the woman, Danny is the husband, what she is struggling with is, of course, that he's turned into a murderous monster, but that he seems to be the same guy that she married and that she fell in love with. And they've been married literally like a day at this point, 2 days. Right? It's literally their honeymoon. And I think a film like this challenges us to think about how we relate to people, because that scene in a different context could very easily have been Danny shooting heroin instead of Danny eating the neighbor, right? That this could have been a film about drug abuse in which she discovers that Danny is not the person she thought he was and struggles with what to do about his, say, criminal lifestyle, from finding money for heroin or just the fact that he's a heroin addict, right? That at the core, this is about how do we understand what people are and who they are? And when they change, are they still the same person? You know, and it doesn't have to be something extreme like turning into a zombie, right? That this is the extreme, this is the outer edge. But, you know, at some point, every one of us is going to have to deal with a loved one who goes through dementia or senility, probably, or someone we know, right? And in that kind of situation, what we see is a family member who is no longer the person they were, right? And often, they end up acting very differently than the person we ever knew. My grandmother started swearing at us, for instance, which we all got a good laugh out of after we stopped crying, right? That when someone starts to change, you have to really struggle to think about what is it that I'm doing here? What am I getting out of the relationship to that person, right? Because you still love them, but you don't love this person they are now, because that's not them. But you have fealty to them. You feel love for them, and you want to care for them. And that's what Denise is going through here. Right? Especially as Danny, I mean, there's a great scene where he says, I'm just trying to eat as few people as I can before we leave the country. Right? It's this ludicrous idea, right? Because they construct this notion that if they go to Portugal, everything will be better. Because of course it would. Wouldn't everything be better in Portugal? You know, I think a film like this also encourages us to ponder our own mortality, right? It helps us think about what does it mean for me to be on that end of things. Right? Because the other side of the coin from the that's not your mother anymore is don't let me end up walking around like that. The classic scene from the original Dawn of the Dead where one of the characters has been bitten and is turning but hasn't turned yet, says, I'm not going to come back. I'm going to try not to come back. But if I do, don't let me be walking around like that. Which is interesting because at no point has the character shown this idea that the other people, the other zombies, are still the people, right? They've fully embraced this idea that the person in that the zombie is no longer the person. But they cling strongly to the idea that they don't want to be walking around like that. One philosopher I've read suggests that it's because we can't conceive of that body not being us. That it's very difficult to even conceive that we could. So somewhere deep in our mind, even if we imagine that the zombie is not us, we still imagine that we'll be trapped inside, like in Being John Malkovich, right? Or there's actually a really great zombie short story where the whole story is told from the first person point of view of a guy trapped inside his own zombie body, and he can't control what his zombie body's doing. It's a terrifying idea. Because I think that, for me, that is one of the things that's most terrifying about the zombie itself, right? Comes from the voodoo idea, right? The idea that not that you're dead and your body is walking around, but that you're trapped inside that dead body walking around, and you can't control what you're doing. Right? The tagline for the terrible movie Serpent in the Rainbow was, "Don't bury me, I'm not already dead." It's a great, or I'm not dead yet. It's a great quote because the character is trapped inside. It's something you can do in cinema very easily, right? You give him the first-person narrator while the body is being put in a casket and they put a tarantula on his face. Because of course you would. All right. I would also suggest that it does challenge us to think about what makes us who we are. In a very simple way, we all are willing to accept the idea that we change over time, right? That we are not the person we were 5 years ago. And there are certainly things in our lives that make it more difficult to understand, right? We all are aware of the way that, say, alcohol changes someone's behavior. And some people talk about in vino veritas, the idea that truth is what comes out when you're drunk. But I think there's an argument to be made that when you lose your control over yourself, the expression made isn't necessarily more true, but rather uncontrolled, right? It goes back to for me, the fear of being out of control of myself. But I think that when you think about how we are engaging in a ever steady advance in our ability to control how people act through pharmacological drugs, through surgery, et cetera, that we're starting to get to this point where, say you have been a mopey person all your life, and you discover that you, in fact, are depressive, and you start taking an antidepressant, and suddenly you're not a mopey person anymore. You are going to act very differently in your life. And people will probably say, he's like a totally different person. Are you the same person if your brain chemistry has been altered that much? At what point do we draw the line? Right? The other two places I would say that this conversation really ties in, right, are not the senility end of line where the mind goes and the body works, but the other end actually I guess it's where the mind goes in a different way. Something like persistent vegetative state. Right? The Terry Schiavo case from several years ago where there was a woman whose body had been alive for several years, but as far as the doctors could tell, her mind was not. But unlike someone in a coma, a persistent vegetative state, you move, your hands move, your eyes open and close, you appear to track things sometimes. As far as they can tell, there's nothing going on in your mind, but you appear to be moving. That is a frightening prospect for many of us. And the idea of how do we understand how much of a person that person is. Right on the other end of things, our country is still at strong debate over when someone starts being a person. Right? That is the core of the abortion debate. Okay. So all of these things come into play when we start watching zombie films, especially the films that get past the apocalypse scenario that we see in most Hollywood zombie films and start making the zombie more interesting.